The story begins with two infants abandoned by fate, Romulus and Remus, twin sons of Rhea Silvia and the war god Mars. Cast into the Tiber River by a usurper who feared their bloodline, they should have drowned, but destiny had other plans. The river did not claim them, it carried them to safety. And on its muddy banks, beneath a sky thick with omen, a shadow emerged, a she-wolf, golden eyes burning in the moonlight. She saw no prey, only sons. She nursed them, guarded them, and in that cradle of reeds under divine watch, Rome's first heartbeat pulsed into being. They were later raised by a shepherd, Faustulus, and they grew into warriors, cunning, fierce, unyielding. When they uncovered the truth of their past, they rose in rebellion, toppling the wicked Amulius, and restoring their grandfather to the throne of Alba Longa. But their ambition didn't stop there. They would build a new city, a legacy of their own. Yet, brotherhood turned to bloodshed. A bitter feud over where to found their city, pride flared, tempers snapped. And in a moment that would stain eternity, Romulus struck down Remus. The first walls of Rome were not built of stone. They were built on sacrifice. And so, in the year 753 BCE, on the banks of the Tiber, Rome was born. Rome's earliest rulers were kings, each one shaping the young city with his own vision. Some built, some conquered, some were betrayed, but all laid the foundation for empire. Romulus, the warrior king, was first. He organized clans, forged alliances, laid the groundwork for Roman politics, but his legacy carried a darker note. Lacking women for his people, he devised a plan, the rape of the Sabine women. At a grand festival, Roman men seized the Sabine daughters, dragging them from their families into forced marriage. War seemed inevitable. But then the unexpected happened. The women intervened. Now mothers, now wives, they stood between their Sabine fathers and their Roman husbands. What Rome had stolen, it now bound with blood and kin. After Romulus vanished into legend, the throne passed to Numa Pompilius, a man of peace and wisdom. He shaped Rome's religious identity, temples, sacred rites, priesthoods. Under Numa, Rome learned not only how to fight, but how to pray. Then came Tullus Hostilius. If Numa was water, Tullus was fire. His reign was war. The destruction of Alba Longa, the brutal duel of the Horatii and Curiati, and Rome's transformation into a military machine. Ancus Marcius followed, a ruler who balanced the sword with the plough. He fortified Rome's walls, built its first bridge over the Tiber, founded Ostia, Rome's gateway to the sea. Trade blossomed, so did Rome's appetite. And then came the Etruscans. Rome's last three kings were not Roman. They were Etruscans, masters of architecture, engineering, and shadowy politics. Tarquinius Priscus expanded the Senate. He began the city's great building works, the Circus Maximus, the Cloaca Maxima. Rome was evolving from city to civilization, but ambition breeds enemies. Priscus was assassinated, cut down by rivals who feared his growing influence. His successor was Servius Tullius, a man of murky origins. Some say a slave, others a royal. But Servius proved his worth. He restructured society, dividing Romans by wealth and military duty. He laid the groundwork for a Rome of order and strength. But his end was soaked in treachery. His daughter Tullia plotted against him with her husband Lucius Tarquinius Superbus. They struck. Servius was dragged from the Senate house and butchered in the street, and Tullia, cold, relentless, drove her chariot over his body. The wheels crushed her father beneath them. Rome had learned a terrible truth. Power was never given, it was taken, and Tarquin had taken it all. Tarquinius Superbus ruled with an iron fist. He silenced the Senate, eliminated opposition, and ruled not by law, but by fear. But even fear has its limits. His undoing came not from generals, but from a woman. Lucretia, a noblewoman praised for her virtue. She was raped by Tarquin's son Sextus. Shamed beyond endurance, she took her own life. But before she died, she called for vengeance. Her body was displayed before the Roman people, and grief turned to rage. A nobleman, Lucius Junius Brutus, once dismissed as a fool, rose to lead the revolt. The people answered his call. They stormed the palace, tore down the symbols of tyranny, and drove Tarquin into exile. He tried to return. He raised armies, but Rome had shut its gates forever. He died in exile, his name forever cursed. And from the ashes of the monarchy, a new idea emerged. The Republic, a system ruled not by kings, but by citizens, senators, generals, men of ambition and vision. But Rome had learned from its kings, power is never safe, never stable. It would take a republic to hold it in check. For a time, The fall of Rome's monarchy was not a peaceful transition. It was a reckoning, a rebellion born from tyranny, betrayal, and bloodshed. The Tarquin dynasty had been cast into exile, but their shadow still loomed over Rome. The city stood at a crossroads, no longer bound by a king, yet not entirely free from the weight of its past. This was not the dawn of an empire, nor the calm foundation of a new order. It was a moment of uncertainty. A fragile experiment in governance, born not of careful planning but of desperation, of necessity. Lucius Junius Brutus, the man who had led the revolt, now stood as one of Rome's first consuls. Alongside him, Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, the husband of Lucretia, whose tragedy had ignited the flame of revolution. But Rome was not yet safe. The exiled king, Tarquinius Superbus, refused to vanish into history. He turned outward to Etruria, to Veii, and to the mighty Lars Porsena of Clusium. War came swiftly. Porsena's armies marched on Rome. The Republic, still in its infancy, stood on the brink of annihilation. Yet Rome did not bow. Here legends were born. Horatius Cocles, holding the bridge alone. Mucius Scaevola, thrusting his hand into the flames to show Rome would not be broken. Their courage became Rome's defiance. And against all odds, the city endured. Porsena withdrew. The king remained in exile. And finally, at the Battle of Lake Regillus, the last embers of monarchy were crushed beneath the Republic's rising heel. The kings were gone, but the scars they left behind shaped everything that came next. The monarchy had fallen, but tyranny had not been banished. It had been restrained, watched, feared, remembered. Rome had not simply overthrown a king, it had built a warning into its very foundation. Never again would power lie in the hands of one man. Instead, Rome forged something new. A republic, not born from hope but from trauma. A system not designed for peace but for prevention, to stop what had already happened from ever happening again. The expulsion of Rome's monarchy left behind more than just a void. It left behind fear, fear of kings, fear of tyranny, fear that history would repeat itself. Rome did not replace one ruler with another. Instead, it built something far more complex. A system not meant to be ruled, but to be balanced. Where power was not seized, but shared. Where ambition was not celebrated, but contained. It was a system of tension, of checks, of constant struggle. And for centuries it would define Rome. At the core of this fragile new order stood the Senate. Once merely a council beneath the kings, it now emerged as the Republic's enduring spine. But this was no voice of the people. Senators weren't elected, they were chosen. Drawn from Rome's oldest, wealthiest, most powerful families. Their power came not from votes, but from legacy. And yet it was the Senate that guided Rome's destiny. It controlled the treasury, commanded foreign policy, directed the Republic's wars. It did not rule outright, but it governed, absolutely. Rome had cast off its crown, but behind its new face, an aristocracy still held the reins. But power could never remain in one place. It had to be divided, fragmented, dismantled, and rebuilt. Rome's executive authority rested not in a single ruler, but in a hierarchy of elected officials known as magistrates. At the top stood the consuls, 2 men, elected each year, equal in power, each able to veto the other. They commanded armies, presided over the Senate, enforced the law, but even they were not above the Republic. Beneath them, praetors, guardians of justice, overseeing Rome's courts, quaestors, keepers of the treasury, managing public funds, aediles, caretakers of the city, maintaining roads, markets, and festivals, censors, rare but powerful, conducting the census and even purging corruption from the Senate. But no office was permanent. Terms were short, decisions were shared, authority was temporary. Power in Rome was never owned, it was borrowed, and always it came with a cost. Despite aristocratic control, Rome was not a pure oligarchy. The people had a voice, but it was faint, constrained, shaped by the weight of wealth and tradition. The Centuriate Assembly, elected consuls, declared war, passed laws, but its design favored the rich. The wealthiest classes voted first. If they reached a majority, the poor never voted at all. The tribal assembly was more equal. It represented Rome's regions, not its wealth. But even here, influence tilted toward the elite. But the true voice of the common people came from a body of their own, the plebeian council. Here, they elected their champions, the tribunes of the plebs. These men had no armies, no great estates, no ancient bloodlines, but they wielded something greater, the veto. If a law threatened the plebeians, they could stop it with a single word, intercessio. I forbid it, a single word that could bring the Republic to a standstill. But such power was never safe, never settled, always contested, always under siege, because in Rome, the struggle for power never ended. The Roman Republic was a masterpiece of design, but it was never a peaceful one. The Senate, the magistrates, the assemblies, each pulled in a different direction, each seeking influence, each preventing the rise of a tyrant. It was a system built not on unity but on controlled discord, a delicate rhythm, balanced on tradition, held together by restraint, by men willing to place the Republic above themselves. But restraint is fragile. Tradition can be broken, and ambition is never easily caged. For now, Rome stood. But even in these early years, the seeds of its future struggles had already been sown. Rome was never built on equality. From the very start, it was a city divided not by walls, but by birth. At the top stood the patricians, an aristocratic elite who controlled power, law, and religion. Below them, the plebeians, the commoners, labored, fought, and sacrificed for a republic that offered them little in return. They paid the taxes, they filled the legions. But when it came to governance, their voices were silenced. For years, they endured. Until one day, they refused to endure any longer. In 494 BCE, the plebeians abandoned the city. They left their homes, their markets, and, most critically, Rome's army. The Republic stood paralyzed. Without its workers and soldiers, it could not function. The patricians, faced with economic ruin and military collapse, had no choice but to negotiate. From this moment of defiance, a new force was born, the tribune of the plebs, a magistracy dedicated to protecting plebeian rights. These tribunes wielded a power no Roman could ignore. A single word, veto, could halt any decree that threatened the common people. And with this power, the plebeians had secured their first victory. But the fight was far from over. For years, Rome's laws existed only in the minds of patrician magistrates. Twisted, bent, applied however the elite saw fit. If the plebeians were to claim real rights, they needed something permanent, something unbreakable. In 451 BCE, a commission of 10 men, the decemviri, was tasked with writing down Rome's laws for the first time. When their work was done, 12 bronze tablets were displayed in the forum for all to see. The 12 tables laid out justice in ink and metal, ensuring that no man, patrician or plebeian, could bend the law to his will alone. And yet, for all these reforms, the plebeians were still locked out of true power. One office ruled above all, the consulship. It was the highest position in the Republic, and for decades it remained an exclusive patrician stronghold. The plebeians had come too far to stop now. They pushed, they protested, and in 367 BCE, they won. The Lex Licinia Sextia shattered the old order, decreeing that one of the Republic's 2 consuls must be plebeian. No longer could the aristocracy claim absolute rule. No longer could the Republic be governed by the few. But even this was not enough. For years, the plebeians had their own assemblies, their own laws. But those laws, they applied only to plebeians, unless the Senate approved them. The fight for equality had reached its final battleground. In 287 BCE, the Lex Hortensia changed everything. From that moment forward, plebeian laws became laws for all Romans, without Senate approval. The struggle of the orders had ended. The Republic had been reshaped. Yet, victory was not without cost. As political barriers fell, a new aristocracy emerged, not one of birth, but one of wealth. The richest plebeians, now called the nobiles, merged with patricians, forming a new ruling elite. The poorest plebeians, despite all these victories, still struggled for survival. And as Rome grew in power, its greatest struggles would no longer be fought in the halls of government, but on the battlefields of the Mediterranean. The plebeians had won their place in Rome. Now, Rome would fight for its place in the world. It began in uncertainty. The Roman Republic was young, fragile, unproven. It had cast off its kings, but that was only the first battle. The real fight, survival, was just beginning. Enemies surrounded Rome on all sides. To the north, the mighty Etruscans. To the south, rival Latin tribes, each one watching, waiting for weakness. Rome had no empire, no great legions, only determination. And in this world, determination alone was not enough. At first, Rome was just one city among many, a minor force in a land of warring powers. The Latin League, a coalition of neighboring tribes, did not welcome its rise. They saw Rome not as an ally, but as a rival. Conflict was inevitable. Raids turned into battles, battles turned into war. Rome had no choice but to fight for its place in the world, and through sheer resilience, it held firm. But the Latins were not the only threat. To the north stood Veii, one of the richest, most powerful Etruscan cities. Its walls were high, its warriors well-trained. For years, Rome and Veii clashed, neither side willing to yield. Then, in 396 BCE, Rome made its move. A siege, a test of patience, strength, and will. 10 long years passed before Veii's walls finally crumbled. The city was sacked, its people scattered. Rome had conquered a great enemy, and with Veii's wealth now flowing into its coffers, the Republic grew stronger. But no victory lasts forever. Because from the north, something far worse was coming. The attack came without warning. The Gauls, fierce warriors from beyond the Alps, swept down like a storm. Their numbers were overwhelming, their assault relentless. Rome rushed to meet them at the Battle of the Allia. It was a disaster. The Roman army shattered, the city left defenseless, the Gauls poured in, then the horror began. Flames devoured homes and temples. Blood ran through the streets. The Senate, Rome's symbol of authority, sat motionless as the invaders approached, too proud to run, too dignified to beg. One by one, they were slaughtered where they sat. The survivors fled to the Capitoline Hill, their last refuge. From there, they watched their city burn. Days turned into weeks, then months. The Gauls remained, looting what was left. Rome's fate hung by a thread, then a flicker of defiance. Legends tell of the sacred geese of Juno, their cries warning the defenders of a surprise attack, a desperate final stand. But in the end, it was not enough. Rome had to buy its survival, a humiliating ransom paid in gold. Only then did the Gauls withdraw. When the survivors stepped out from their hiding places, they found their city in ruins, the streets empty, their homes nothing but ash. But their spirit, that was something else entirely. Rome had been brought to its knees. Humiliated, devastated, broken. But Rome would not die. They rebuilt their walls, stronger than before. They restructured their army, smarter, deadlier. They vowed no enemy would ever breach Rome's defenses again. The sack of Rome was not the end. It was a rebirth, a turning point. The moment Rome realized that survival was not enough, it needed strength, it needed power, it needed to become something greater. And from that moment on, it would stop at nothing to ensure that no enemy, no matter how fierce, would ever threaten its existence again. This was the fire that would forge an empire, and this was only the beginning. In the rugged heartlands of central Italy, where the Apennines carved deep valleys and steep mountain passes, a bitter struggle for dominance was about to unfold. The Samnites, fierce warriors of the highlands, stood as an unyielding barrier to Rome's growing ambition. For decades, these two powers would clash in a trilogy of brutal wars. Battles fought in ravines and strongholds, testing endurance to its limits. Defeats were suffered, hard lessons were learned. But from these crucibles, Rome would emerge, stronger, sharper, utterly transformed. This was not just a war for land, it was a war to decide who would rule the Italian peninsula. The spark came in the south. The Samnites had turned against the Greek colony of Neapolis, modern-day Naples. Under siege, the city called out for help. Rome answered. Eager to assert its rising power, the Republic sent its legions marching through unfamiliar hills and rugged paths. The first encounters were swift and brutal, Roman discipline versus Samnite ferocity. The Samnites, masters of ambush tactics, struck hard. But Rome held its ground. It pushed deep into enemy territory, forcing a peace treaty. The war was short, but the tension lingered. The conflict had not ended, it had only set the stage. Then came the real test. This war stretched nearly 2 decades, a long, grinding struggle that bled both sides. In 321 BCE, Rome suffered a disaster unlike any before. At the narrow mountain pass of Caudine Forks, an entire Roman army was trapped, boxed in by the terrain, outmaneuvered by the Samnites. With no escape, the legions surrendered. But worse than the defeat was the humiliation. The Romans were forced to pass under the yoke, a degrading ritual where soldiers walked beneath crossed spears, stripped of dignity, a symbol of total submission. Rome's pride was shattered. But the Republic did not collapse, it evolved. Determined never to suffer such shame again, Rome changed how it fought. Roads were built, long stone arteries to move troops with speed and precision. Fortified colonies rose, locking down the land, and the Roman army became something else entirely. Sharper, harder, more professional. The tide turned. Slowly, painfully, but surely, Rome clawed back its honor, one battle at a time. And when the war finally ended, it was not the Samnites who stood tall. It was Rome. The final war was the fiercest and the most fateful. This time, it wasn't just Rome versus Samnium. It was a battle for the soul of Italy. The Samnites, fearing Rome's rise, rallied powerful allies: the Etruscans, Umbrians, and even the northern Gauls. Together, they formed a great coalition to crush Rome before it became unstoppable. The decisive clash came at Sentinum in 295 BCE. The battlefield shook with the fury of thousands. Amid the chaos, Roman consul Publius Decius Mus performed the ancient rite of devotia, offering his life to the gods. Alone, he charged into the enemy lines, sacrificing himself for victory. His men, inspired by the act, surged forward with renewed fury. By day's end, the coalition was broken. The battlefield belonged to Rome. Samnium was shattered. The alliance destroyed. The war over. Now, Samnium would become what many others soon would: a humbled ally beneath Rome's expanding shadow. The Samnite Wars reshaped Rome. They were more than a contest of armies. They were a forge, melting down pride, tempering steel, reforging a republic into something stronger. Out of ambushes and defeats came transformation. Out of shame came strategy. The Via Appia was laid, Rome's first great road, stretching deep into conquered lands. Military reforms hardened the legions into a fearsome machine. But the greatest change was in Rome's soul. It had learned something eternal: that no defeat was final, that no humiliation was permanent, that every failure was a lesson, every setback a stepping stone. And now, with central Italy under its command, Rome stood ready to claim more. The Samnite Wars had forged a weapon. Now it would be unleashed. Victory does not always come without sacrifice. For Rome, the Pyrrhic War was more than just another campaign. It was a reckoning. A clash not with tribes or mountain warriors, but with a commander molded in the shadow of Alexander the Great himself, King Pyrrhus of Epirus. It began in the south. The Greek city of Tarentum, fearing Rome's ever-growing influence, called for help. Pyrrhus answered. To him, this wasn't just a noble defense of Greek kin, it was an opportunity. Italy was a prize, a launchpad for future conquests in Sicily, Carthage, and beyond. With 25,000 men, elite war elephants, and dreams of empire, he crossed the Adriatic Sea. And with him came the thunder of a new kind of war. The first great clash came near the river Siris, Heraclea. The Roman legions marched to meet the invaders. Seasoned, fearless, tested in the mountains of Samnium, they believed no enemy could surprise them. But they had never faced the Macedonian phalanx. The Greek line stood firm, spears bristling, shields locked, an iron wall of discipline. Then came the war elephants, towering beasts that shook the very earth beneath them. The Roman cavalry buckled, horses panicked, infantry broke ranks. The battlefield dissolved into chaos. Pyrrhus had won, but it was no triumph. The price was steep. His elite suffered heavy losses. And then Rome did the unthinkable. It raised another army. There would be no negotiation, no surrender. The war was far from over. A year later, the armies met again, this time at Asculum. Once more, Pyrrhus unleashed his elephants and crushed the Roman lines. Once more, the battlefield belonged to him, but the cost was devastating. His veterans were dead or wounded. Reinforcements dwindled, supplies ran thin. And still, the Romans returned. When his men celebrated the victory, Pyrrhus offered a chilling reply. If we are victorious in one more battle with the Romans, we shall be utterly ruined. Thus, history gave us a new phrase, a Pyrrhic victory. A win so costly it feels like defeat. Frustrated, Pyrrhus turned to Sicily, hoping for easier gains. At first, he won battles against Carthage, but success soured. His harsh rule angered the Sicilian Greeks. Allies abandoned him. Enthusiasm turned to resentment. Disillusioned, he returned to Italy one last time. In 275 BCE at Beneventum, he faced Rome again. But Rome had changed. It had studied him, learned from him. It now used his own tactics, his own elephants against him. When Pyrrhus sent the beasts forward, the Romans outmaneuvered them. The elephants panicked, trampling their own men. Confusion tore through the phalanx. The great army of Epirus collapsed. Pyrrhus, defeated, withdrew. His dreams of empire lay in ruins. He would never return. Rome had won. The Pyrrhic War was not Rome's greatest triumph, but it was among its most important. Against a Hellenistic king trained in the traditions of Alexander's empire, Rome had not only endured, it had prevailed. And in doing so, it proved a simple truth. Roman strength lay not just in arms, but in resilience, in its ability to suffer defeat, absorb it, and rise stronger. It had met the best of the Greek world and matched it. It had cracked the phalanx. It had learned to counter war elephants. It had taken southern Italy. And now, the Republic stood alone atop the peninsula. But across the sea, another power stirred, one that ruled the western Mediterranean, one that would not yield so easily. Carthage, the greatest war of all, was yet to come. The year was 264 BCE. The Mediterranean was more than just a sea. It was a battleground of ambition. Two rising powers now stood at opposite shores, each destined for greatness, each unwilling to yield. Rome, young, aggressive, and unstoppable on land. Carthage, rich, ancient, and master of the seas. Between them lay Sicily, a jewel at the heart of the western Mediterranean. Whoever held it held the future. What began as a dispute over a single city would ignite a brutal conflict that lasted over 2 decades. A war of endurance, a war of innovation, a war that would change the course of history. It began in Messana. A band of rogue mercenaries, the Mamertines, had seized the city, only to find themselves besieged by a local rival. Desperate, they cried out for help, first to Carthage, then to Rome. The Roman Senate hesitated. Sicily was outside their domain. But the thought of Carthage tightening its grip so close to Italy was too dangerous to ignore. And so the decision was made. The legions crossed the strait. Rome had entered Sicily and stepped into a new world. On land, Rome had the edge. Its disciplined legions stormed strongholds across the island, pushing back Carthaginian garrisons and mercenary armies. But the war would not be decided on land. At sea, Carthage reigned supreme. Their fleet was vast, their sailors experienced and deadly. Rome's makeshift navy, untrained and untested, was helpless. One Roman fleet after another was destroyed, swallowed by superior tactics or stormy seas. Then Rome did what Rome always did. It adapted. They captured a Carthaginian warship, studied it, replicated it, then built an entire fleet, larger and stronger. Still, it wasn't enough. Rome needed to change the rules. Enter the corvus, a boarding device, part bridge, part trap with a vicious iron spike. No longer would Rome fight as sailors, they would fight as legionaries, on deck, face to face. The first test came at Mylae in 260 BCE. The Carthaginians came, confident and prepared, but as their ships approached, the corvus came down. Roman soldiers poured across the decks like a tide of steel. This was no naval duel, it was hand-to-hand slaughter, and for the first time Rome had won at sea. But triumph was short-lived. The war dragged on. Storms shattered entire fleets. Roman armies bled in the hills and valleys of Sicily. At times it seemed the gods themselves opposed Rome's ambition. Yet Rome never wavered. They rebuilt what was lost, raised new legions, forged new fleets again and again and again. Carthage, though mighty, began to falter. Their strength spread thin, their mercenaries unreliable, their people weary of war. Then, in 241 BCE, the final blow came. At the Battle of the Aegates Islands, Rome unleashed its rebuilt navy in one last thunderous strike. The sea boiled with shattered hulls and broken oars. The air rang with the clash of iron and the cries of dying men. And when it was over, when the last Carthaginian ship slipped beneath the waves, Rome stood victorious. Carthage was humiliated, forced to cede Sicily, forced to pay a crushing tribute, and though they survived, something inside them shattered. Rome, by contrast, had stepped beyond Italy and planted its banner across the sea. It was more than a military triumph. It was a transformation. Rome was no longer just a city-state, it was becoming an empire. But the price of victory was more than ships or silver. The First Punic War had forged a new enemy, one who would never forget, one who would one day return, not for peace, but for vengeance. For now, Rome celebrated. They had conquered Sicily, they had conquered the sea, and soon they would conquer far more. History is shaped by battles, but some wars define the fate of civilizations. The Second Punic War was one such conflict, a brutal, unrelenting struggle that spanned continents. It tested the might of Rome against the genius of Carthage's greatest warrior. At its heart stood two titans, Hannibal Barca, a master of war, and Publius Cornelius Scipio, the man destined to stop him. Their clash would become legend, a rivalry that would echo through the ages. From the moment of his birth, Hannibal was forged for vengeance. His father, Hamilcar Barca, had fought in the First Punic War, And as a child, Hannibal took a solemn oath to never rest until Rome was destroyed. Now that oath marched across the battlefields of Iberia. His army, hardened by conquest, was relentless. But Hannibal's ambition reached beyond border skirmishes. He had a plan to strike at Rome itself. Not by sea, where Carthage was strong, but by land, through the towering, frozen peaks of the Alps. It was madness. No army had ever dared such a journey. But with warriors, cavalry, and towering war elephants, Hannibal defied the impossible. Through blizzards, through avalanches, through death and despair, he pressed on. Many fell, but those who survived emerged as something else. Battle-worn, unbreakable, and when they stepped into Italy, they brought with them the wrath of Carthage. Rome was unprepared for the storm that followed. In 218 BCE, at the Battle of Trebia, Hannibal lured the Romans into icy waters, then crushed them with hidden cavalry. It was a slaughter, and it was only the beginning. A year later, Lake Trasimene. In a thick morning mist, Hannibal lay in wait. An entire Roman army marched blindly into his trap. And then he struck. A sudden, savage ambush. 16,000 Romans died that day. Panic spread through the Republic. Rome was reeling. And then came Cannae. It was a battle that would haunt Rome for generations. Desperate, the Republic gathered its largest force yet, 80,000 men, determined to crush Hannibal once and for all. They believed numbers alone would bring victory, but Hannibal had other plans. As the Roman legions advanced, he gave them ground, drawing them in. Step by step, they pressed forward, believing they had him. And then, the trap closed. Carthaginian cavalry struck from both flanks. The Roman formation, packed tight, had nowhere to run. What followed was not a battle, it was a massacre. By sundown, 50,000 Romans were dead. In a single day, a single clash, Rome was brought to its knees. But Rome did not fall. Even in the face of annihilation, the Republic adapted. A new strategy emerged, led by Fabius Maximus, the delayer. He refused to meet Hannibal in open battle. Instead, he starved his army of supplies, wore him down, denied him another Cannae. Rome endured. And while Hannibal ravaged Italy, another force was rising. A young commander, learning, watching, waiting. Publius Cornelius Scipio. While Hannibal campaigned in Italy, Scipio struck at Carthage's empire. In Spain, he launched daring assaults, capturing New Carthage, breaking Carthaginian power in the west. He cut off Hannibal's lifelines, he shattered his alliances, and with each victory, Rome gained ground. Then Scipio made a bold decision. He would not wait. He would carry the war to Africa. Carthage, wounded and desperate, had no choice. They summoned Hannibal home, and so at last the two greatest minds of their age stood face to face at Zama. 202 BCE, the final reckoning. Hannibal commanded an army of veterans, mercenaries, and the last of Carthage's mighty war elephants. As the beasts charged, Scipio's legions stood firm. They opened narrow lanes, allowing the elephants to pass harmlessly through, then struck them down from behind. The elephants fell, and the real battle began. Hour after hour, steel clashed with steel, shield met blade, blood soaked the soil. Hannibal fought with all the brilliance he had, but Scipio had studied him, learned him, outmaneuvered him. Roman cavalry encircled the battlefield, and in one final stroke, Hannibal's army collapsed. Carthage was defeated, its fleet dismantled, its power broken. Its pride shattered, Rome stood victorious, not just over an enemy, but over fate itself. The Second Punic War had brought Rome to the brink of destruction, but it forged something stronger. Rome had survived Cannae, it had faced its worst nightmare, and endured. But even in defeat, Carthage did not die. Deep within the ruins, hatred smoldered. For Rome, the war was over. For Carthage, the end was yet to come. Rome's vengeance was absolute. By 149 BCE, Carthage was no longer an empire. No fleet, no armies beyond its borders, no power to wage war without Rome's consent. And yet, it still stood. To some in the Senate, that was intolerable. None more so than Marcus Porcius Cato, Cato the Elder. He ended every speech with the same unyielding words, Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. And so, Rome made its decision. In 149 BCE, Carthage, desperate to defend itself from a Numidian invasion, took up arms, violating its treaty with Rome. The Senate declared war. Carthage's fate was sealed. Rome's legions landed in North Africa, expecting a swift victory. Instead, they met a people who refused to die quietly. Carthage stood alone, abandoned. No allies, no hope. But its people understood the truth. Surrender meant annihilation, so they turned their city into a fortress. Blacksmiths melted down statues to forge weapons. Temples became armories. The young, the old, the desperate, all prepared to fight, and fight they did. For 3 long years, Rome battered the city. Yet again and again, the Carthaginians held. Towers collapsed, siege engines burned, the streets ran red. They fought with a fury Rome had never seen. But no army can fight forever. Starvation set in. The people of Carthage wasted away inside their own walls. And then Rome sent the man who would end it. In 447 BCE, the Senate turned to Scipio Aemilianus, the grandson of Scipio Africanus, the conqueror of Hannibal. He would finish what his ancestor had begun. Scipio tightened the siege. He cut off every last supply line, choking the city into submission. Famine swept through Carthage, bodies littered the streets. Still, the Carthaginians would not surrender. So in 146 BCE, Rome made its final move. The legions breached the walls. What followed was not a battle, it was a slaughter. Roman soldiers poured into the city, blades drawn, vengeance burning in their eyes. The defenders fought with madness. They knew their fate was already sealed. For 6 days, Carthage burned. Tens of thousands butchered. Flames devoured homes, temples, markets. The air was thick with smoke and the screams of the dying. The last survivors made their final stand on the Bursa, Carthage's citadel. They knew what awaited them. So rather than face Roman chains, they leapt into the fire. By the 7th day, Carthage was no more. The survivors were enslaved by the thousands. Their city, erased from existence. According to legend, the Romans salted the earth so that nothing would ever grow there again. Rome now ruled the Mediterranean, unchallenged. No rivals, no threats. Only Rome and its hunger for power. Carthage was gone, but Rome's wars were far from over. But in its destruction of Carthage, Rome revealed something deeper. Not just a hunger for victory, but for domination. A ruthless, unforgiving need for absolute control. For centuries, that hunger had turned outward, devouring foreign enemies. Now, it would turn inward. The Republic had triumphed, but at what cost? Rome stood unchallenged. Carthage no more. And the Mediterranean, once a battleground of rival empires, now bowed to Rome's dominion. Wealth flooded the Republic, gold and silver from conquered lands, grain from distant provinces, tribute from the defeated. Yet beneath this triumph, something was shifting. The very foundations of Rome, its people, its economy, its way of life, were beginning to crack. For centuries, Rome had been a republic of citizen farmers. Men who tilled their fields by day and defended the Republic by sword when duty called. But war changed everything. As Rome expanded, so did its hunger for land. The ager publicus, public land seized from the conquered, was meant to be shared among Roman citizens. But in practice, the wealthy elite claimed it for themselves, twisting laws to serve their own interests. Massive estates, known as latifundia, spread across the countryside. Vast plantations worked not by Roman hands, but by slaves. And so, when the legions returned from war, many found themselves displaced. Their farms, once their livelihood, had been swallowed by the estates of the rich. Landless and destitute, these men, once the backbone of Rome's army, had nowhere to go but the city. Early attempts to fix the crisis came with the Licinian rogations of 367 BCE, laws designed to limit how much land one man could hold. But laws mean little when those in power refuse to enforce them. The wealthy tightened their grip, and the gap between rich and poor grew ever wider. As Rome's farmlands fell into fewer hands, the Republic's economy turned outward. Grain from Sicily, Sardinia, and North Africa poured into Rome's granaries, cheap, plentiful, and devastating to those still trying to farm. Meanwhile, Roman merchants flourished. Wine, olive oil, pottery, metalwork. Their goods reached every corner of the known world, traded for spices, silk, and ivory from the east. At the heart of it all was Ostia, Rome's bustling port, a gateway to the empire, a place where fortunes were made and where a new class of power emerged. The Equites, Rome's wealthy businessmen. They financed military campaigns, controlled trade, funded public works, and in doing so, they became a force unto themselves. No longer just merchants. Now, they were power brokers, rivals to the Senate itself. But prosperity was not for all. As the rich grew richer, the poor sank deeper into struggle. The streets of Rome swelled with those who had lost everything. The Republic had conquered the world, but in doing so, it had set itself on a course toward its greatest struggle yet. Despite economic upheaval and growing inequality, the rhythms of Roman life remained unbroken. Society prized order, discipline, and the relentless pursuit of greatness. At dawn, the city awakened. Merchants hurried to set up their stalls. Senators walked with purpose toward the forum. And children, some eager, others reluctant, began their lessons. Education was a privilege. Boys from noble families studied rhetoric, philosophy, and literature, preparing for lives in politics or law. The lower classes learned trades from their fathers: carpentry, metalwork, farming, skills that kept the republic running. Girls trained at home mastered the art of managing a household, securing their place in Roman society. The Forum was the republic's heart. Here orators debated laws, merchants haggled over goods, and plebeians raised their voices, demanding to be heard. But Romans did not live by duty alone. They craved spectacle. Chariots thundered through the Circus Maximus. Theatres echoed with laughter and sorrow. And in the arenas, men fought and bled, not just for survival, but for glory. At home, the paterfamilias, the male head of the family, ruled with absolute authority. He controlled finances, arranged marriages, and held the power to discipline, even disown, his own children. But Roman women were not without influence. Many managed vast estates, and in the later Republic, some shaped politics through their husbands and their sons. Religion touched every aspect of life. Every home had a shrine, a lararium, where families prayed to their household gods. Festivals honored mighty deities, Jupiter, Mars, Vesta, seeking favor in war and in peace. For the common Roman, life was a delicate balance: duty and leisure, hardship and celebration. The Republic demanded everything from its people, but as long as Rome stood, they would endure. The Roman Republic was not built by laws and legions alone. It was shaped by men whose choices defined the very spirit of Rome. Some were paragons of virtue, others cautionary tales of unchecked ambition. Their names would echo through the ages, woven into the fabric of Roman identity. In 458 BCE, Rome stood on the edge of calamity. The Equi, a fierce Italic tribe, had encircled a Roman army, trapped in a narrow valley with no hope of escape. Panic gripped the city. The Senate needed a savior, someone who could wield absolute power but not be consumed by it. They turned to Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus. But Cincinnatus was no general wrapped in glory, no senator cloaked in marble dignity. When the envoys found him, he was in the fields, ploughing his own land, a citizen, a farmer, a Roman. He wiped the soil from his hands, donned his toga, and accepted the mantle of dictator. In just 16 days, he rallied the legions, crushed the Equi, freed the encircled army, and restored Rome's honor. And then he gave it all back. Cincinnatus stepped down, relinquished his power, returned to his plough. No triumphal parade, no golden rewards, only duty fulfilled. For centuries, his name stood as the embodiment of Roman virtue, a reminder that true greatness lies in restraint. That power, when held by the honorable, is a burden, not a prize. Gaius Marcius Coriolanus was everything Cincinnatus was not: a warrior, a conqueror, a man whose sword carved a name into history. His glory came in the siege of Corioli, a Volscian stronghold. When others faltered, he led the charge, broke the enemy lines, and seized the city in a storm of steel. For this, he was honored with a new name: Coriolanus, the man who took Corioli. But his triumph on the battlefield was rivaled only by his arrogance in the Senate. A proud patrician, he held the plebeians in contempt. And when famine struck Rome, he opposed distributing grain to the hungry masses, believing aid should be earned, not given. The people rose against him. The Senate, pressured by public fury, turned its back. Coriolanus was condemned, exiled from the city he had once saved. But exile didn't break him, it ignited him. He joined the Volsci, Rome's sworn enemies, and marched with them against his homeland. As their army approached the city gates, Rome braced for annihilation. And then a procession emerged. Not soldiers, not senators, but women, his wife, his children, his mother. They pleaded with him to remember his home, to remember who he was. Torn between vengeance and love, Coriolanus made his choice. He turned away, he spared Rome, but mercy was betrayal in the eyes of the Volsci, and for that they killed him. His name became a cautionary tale, a reminder that even Rome's greatest sons could become its gravest threats. But not all of Rome's heroes wore armor. Some shaped the Republic not with steel, but with stone and law and vision. Appius Claudius Caecus was one of them. As censor in 312 BCE, he defied tradition. He opened the Senate to plebeians, breaking the monopoly of patrician power. The elite were outraged, but Appius pressed on. He saw a Rome that was bigger, broader, more united, and he built it. His greatest legacy still bears his name, the Via Appia, Rome's first great road. A highway that stretched from the capital to Capua, binding the Republic's heart to its limbs. It carried armies, merchants, and messengers, and laid the path for empire. Then came the Aqua Appia, an aqueduct that brought fresh water into Rome, nourishing the people and laying the foundation for the engineering marvels to come. Even as blindness stole his sight, Appius never lost his vision. When King Pyrrhus of Epirus threatened Rome, and the Senate hesitated, it was the voice of the old, sightless Appius that thundered through the Curia. Rome would bow to no foreign king. That defiance steeled the Republic's spine. He could no longer see the city he helped shape, but Rome could see his legacy everywhere. Cincinnatus, Coriolanus, Appius Claudius, each one a mirror, reflecting a different face of the Republic, virtue and ambition, honor and pride, vision and vengeance. Some became ideals, others warnings. But together, they laid the foundation for a republic destined to rule the known world. And in their stories, Rome's heart still beats. Rome had conquered vast lands, subdued mighty empires, and reshaped the world in its image. But within its own borders, cracks were forming. The Republic, once built on shared sacrifice and iron discipline, was beginning to unravel. For centuries, Rome had prided itself on order, on laws that held even the powerful in check, on traditions that bound rich and poor, patrician and plebeian, into one republic. But now, ambition outweighed duty, corruption ate through principle, and violence had become a tool, not of enemies but of politicians. The dream of the Republic was fading. In its place rose something darker, a new Rome, one born not of unity but of conflict. And the men who stepped into this storm would shape its destiny, for better or for worse. Two brothers, two visions, one fate. Tiberius Gracchus, elected tribune in 133 BCE, saw what others refused to see. Rome's veterans, men who had bled for the Republic, returned home to find their lands seized, their families destitute, their sacrifices forgotten. The wealthy elite had grown richer than ever. Their latifundia, vast estates, were worked by slaves. And Rome's poor, they had nothing. Tiberius offered a bold solution: land reform. Confiscate public land illegally taken by the elite, redistribute it to the poor, give Rome back to its people. But his methods broke the rules. He bypassed the Senate, appealed directly to the people. He defied tradition, he challenged the old order, and for that, the Senate would never forgive him. A mob of enraged aristocrats descended on him. In the heart of Rome, beneath the gaze of its temples, they clubbed him to death. In the streets, his body was tossed into the Tiber like garbage. A message had been sent, a warning to anyone who dared defy the ruling class. But the fire had already been lit. 10 years later, his younger brother, Gaius Gracchus, stepped forward. Where Tiberius had been idealistic, Gaius was strategic, more passionate, more radical. He pushed further: laws to sell grain to the poor at reduced prices, roads and colonies to provide opportunity, citizenship rights for Rome's Italian allies, and a direct blow to the Senate's authority. He wanted to remake the Republic, but the Senate had learned its lesson. They wouldn't wait this time. They declared Gaius an enemy of the state. He was hunted, cornered, surrounded on the Aventine Hill, and with no way out, he chose death. Whether by an assassin's blade or by his own hand, Gaius fell. And with him, 3,000 of his followers were slaughtered, in the streets, in alleys, on temple steps. No trial, no mercy, only blood. Rome had crossed the line. Political murder was no longer a horror, it was now a tactic, a tool of statecraft. The Republic had survived the Gracchi, but it had been changed forever, and in that change lay the seeds of its destruction. The deaths of the Gracchi did not silence the calls for reform. If anything, they deepened Rome's wounds. From the chaos, two factions emerged: the Populares, champions of the people, and the Optimates, guardians of the old order, defenders of the Senate's grip on power. At first, their struggle was political: fierce debates, vicious rhetoric, power plays behind closed doors. But politics in Rome did not stay in the Senate for long. Soon their rivalry spilled into the streets. Violence, once unthinkable in the heart of the Republic, became common. Mobs replaced votes, bribes replaced debate. Elections were no longer won by argument, but by intimidation. by blood. The Republic still stood, but its foundations, order, tradition, restraint, were crumbling. Its heart was rotting from within. For decades, Rome's Italian allies had marched beside its legions. They had fought, bled, died, but they remained outsiders, denied citizenship, denied the rights and dignity of Romans, despite shedding the same blood on the same fields. Then, in 91 BCE, came the breaking point. Rome's broken promises ignited rebellion. The social war. Rome's former allies, now rebels, formed a new state. They forged a rival senate, minted their own coins, raised armies trained in Roman discipline. They knew Rome's strategies. They knew her weaknesses. And for the first time, Rome faced a war against those who had once fought for her. The fighting was brutal. City after city burned. Brother fought against brother. Rome eventually prevailed, but it came at a cost. To end the bloodshed, citizenship was granted, not as a reward, but as a concession. The war had ended, but Rome was forever changed. She had turned her sword against her own, and in doing so, she set the stage for something far worse. While Rome battled its allies, another storm was rising, a fire from within. For centuries, Rome had thrived on slavery. Millions toiled in the shadows, in fields, in mines, in homes, an invisible force that powered the Republic. But the enslaved were not silent. The first great revolt erupted in Sicily. Led by the mystic rebel Eunice, thousands of slaves seized cities, defied commanders, and held off Roman legions. Though crushed, it was only the beginning. Then came Spartacus, a Thracian gladiator, a man trained to entertain with blood who turned his chains into weapons. In 73 BCE, he escaped a gladiatorial school in Capua. What began as a desperate bid for freedom became a war. Slaves, fugitives, even disillusioned citizens flocked to his cause. 70,000 strong, they shattered legion after legion. They humiliated Rome's finest. But Spartacus did not seek to conquer. He sought escape. His dream? Freedom beyond Rome's reach. But Rome would not allow it. The Senate, humiliated and desperate, turned to Marcus Licinius Crassus, Rome's wealthiest man, ruthless, calculating, unrelenting. He pursued Spartacus with fury. Cornered in the south, Spartacus and his army made their final stand. They fought with everything, to the death. Spartacus's body was never found. His rebellion was crushed. But the message was unforgettable. As a warning to all who might rise again, Crassus lined the Appian Way with 6,000 crucified slaves. Their bodies hung for miles. A road of death, a road paved with terror. The message was clear. Rome's power was built on blood, and it would be maintained at any cost. But beneath Rome's victories, beneath its glory, a deeper crisis festered. The rise of latifundia, enormous estates worked by slaves, had concentrated wealth in the hands of the few. The once proud Roman farmer, citizen, soldier, pillar of the Republic was vanishing. In his place, an empire of landowners, an economy built on exploitation. Those who lost everything, they flooded into Rome, hungry, displaced, reliant on state grain, restless, desperate. The citizen soldier, who had once fought out of loyalty to Rome, was now replaced by professional armies. Armies that no longer fought for the Republic, but for their generals. And those generals were no longer content with victory. They wanted power. The Republic still stood, but for how much longer? The answer lay in the names that were rising: Marius, Sulla, and a man whose ambition would eclipse them all, Julius Caesar. Their rise would not just shake the Republic, it would tear it apart. Though Rome had conquered the world, it could not conquer itself. For centuries, the Republic had stood as a delicate balance, competing interests held in check by tradition, by law, by an unspoken pact that no single man should ever hold absolute power. But ambition is relentless. The Senate, once the heart of Roman governance, had become a battlefield, a den of corruption consumed by bitter rivalries. Political violence, once unthinkable, now stained the streets of Rome. And the legions, those mighty instruments of conquest, had found new masters. No longer did they serve the Republic, they served the men who led them. The age of statesmen was fading. In its place, an age of warlords. And it began with two men: Gaius Marius, hero of the common people; Lucius Cornelius Sulla, champion of the Senate's authority. Their struggle would ignite a fire that could not be extinguished, a fire that would consume the Republic itself. Rome had always been a republic of laws. Political battles were fought in the Senate, power shifted through elections. But by the late 2nd century BCE, a new force had emerged. one that cared little for laws, one that settled disputes not with words, but with swords. That force was the legions. The first man to wield them as a personal weapon was Gaius Marius, a self-made soldier, born not to privilege but to hardship. A man who rose through sheer talent and relentless ambition. He crushed Rome's enemies, Jugurtha of Numidia, the Germanic hordes, and in doing so, he reshaped the Roman army. For centuries, only land-owning citizens had served, men who fought, then returned to their farms. But Marius needed more men, and so he did the unthinkable. He opened the ranks to the landless poor. These new soldiers had no homes to return to, no wealth, no legacy. Only one future, what their general could give them. They did not fight for the Republic, they fought for Marius, and Rome would pay the price. But the man who would wield the legions with greater ruthlessness was his greatest rival, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, an aristocrat by birth, a brutal politician by nature. Where Marius stood with the masses, Sulla fought for the Senate. Their rivalry simmered for years, until in 88 BCE it exploded. The spark? Command of an army. The Senate appointed Sulla to lead a campaign against Mithridates, king of Pontus. But Marius, unwilling to be cast aside, used mob violence to overturn the decision. Sulla had a choice: submit or strike back. He chose war. For the first time in history, a Roman general marched his legions against Rome itself. Marius fled into exile. The Republic stood in shock. The unthinkable had happened. But it was only the beginning. While Sulla campaigned in the east, Marius returned. And he returned with vengeance. His forces seized the city. A reign of terror followed. Enemies butchered. Corpses littered the forum. Rome wept. Yet fate would not grant him peace. In 86 BCE, Marius died. Some said of pleurisy. Others whispered madness, haunted by the ghosts of those he had slain. But Sulla still lived. And when he returned in 83 BCE, he came as a conqueror. His victory was swift. His vengeance merciless. Thousands perished in his prescriptions. Political enemies hunted down, their names carved onto death lists. Rome had never seen such terror. And then Sulla did something no one expected. He resigned. He walked away from power. He retired to a villa, drank, wrote his memoirs, and slowly decayed from within. Some said ulcers. Others whispered of a disease so vile, his body rotted while he still breathed. But one truth remained. Rome had changed, and it would never go back. By the mid-1st century BCE, Rome was no longer ruled by laws. It was ruled by force. And in this world of shifting loyalties and broken promises, three men rose above all others: Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great, Marcus Licinius Crassus. In 60 BCE, they forged a secret pact. Not a government institution, not a Senate decree, just a private understanding, a quiet agreement to control Rome from the shadows. Pompey, the Republic's greatest general, had conquered vast lands. But the Senate refused to grant his veterans their promised rewards. Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, had crushed Spartacus's revolt, but yearned for military glory to match his fortune. And Caesar, drowning in debt, had the love of the people, but needed the power to make that loyalty count. So they made a deal. Caesar would become consul, Pompey's veterans would get their land, Crassus would gain financial favors and influence, and the Senate? The Senate would be ignored. For a time, the plan worked. Caesar secured his command in Gaul. Pompey ruled Rome in his absence. Crassus plotted his ascent, but ambition does not share power. By 56 BC, the alliance was cracking. Pompey resented Caesar's growing fame. Crassus, hungry for glory, envied them both. To salvage their pact, the three met in Lucca. They renewed their alliance. Caesar's command was extended. Pompey and Crassus shared the consulship, but fate had other plans. Crassus longed for a crown of victory. In 53 BCE, he marched east into Parthia. He sought triumph. Instead, he found disaster. At Carrhae, his legions were surrounded, trapped, crushed. And when the Parthians captured him, they mocked his greed. They poured molten gold down his throat. With Crassus dead, the balance shattered. Only two men remained, Caesar and Pompey. And Rome was not big enough for both. Without Crassus to keep them united, Pompey and Caesar became rivals. Pompey, once Caesar's mentor, now feared him. The Senate, desperate to rein Caesar in, ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. But Caesar would not bow. In 49 BCE, he stood at the banks of the Rubicon River. One step across, and it would be civil war. One step back, and he would be destroyed. So he crossed. Alea acta est. The die is cast. Caesar marched south, and Rome trembled. The final war for the Republic had begun. Caesar's victory over Pompey was swift, decisive. At Pharsalus, his outnumbered legions shattered Pompey's army. The great general fled east to Egypt seeking refuge, but instead of sanctuary, he found betrayal. As his ship reached the shore, assassins were waiting. Sent by Ptolemy XIII, a boy king desperate to curry favor with Caesar. The moment Pompey stepped onto the beach, they struck. Before his wife, before his son, daggers pierced his body again and again. The man once adored by Rome died alone. His killers severed his head. They sent it as a gift to Caesar. But when Caesar saw it, he did not rejoice. He wept. Yet he did not leave Egypt. Instead, he plunged into its dynastic war. Ptolemy XIII ruled Egypt, but he was not the only claimant to the throne. His sister, Cleopatra VII, had been cast out, driven into exile, but not defeated. She would not grovel. She would not plead. She would reclaim her crown through cunning. She sought an audience with Caesar, but not by day, not by ceremony. She was smuggled into the palace, hidden in a linen sack, carried past guards, and unrolled directly in Caesar's chambers. When the cloth fell away, she stepped forward. The Queen of Egypt, young, brilliant, enigmatic, irresistible. Caesar was captivated, and Cleopatra, she knew how to use captivation. By morning, an alliance was forged, sealed in war, in politics, and in passion. But Ptolemy did not yield. He was pharaoh, and he would not surrender his crown. He raised his armies, and Alexandria, the jewel of the Nile, became a battlefield. For months, the city burned, streets ran red, the palace trembled, and in the chaos, a tragedy. The Library of Alexandria, a temple of ancient knowledge, was consumed by fire, but even that could not stop Caesar. At last, Ptolemy fled. Desperate, he threw himself into the Nile and vanished beneath its waters. Days later, his body surfaced, bloated, lifeless. Cleopatra had won. She took the throne, and by her side stood Caesar, not as a conqueror, but as a kingmaker. From their union came a child, Ptolemy Thetheth, Caesarion. To Cleopatra, he was no ordinary prince. He was the son of Julius Caesar, heir to two empires. But to Rome, he was an abomination, a monarch's child, a living threat to the Republic. When Caesar finally returned to Rome, he did not just leave behind a queen, he left behind a message. His power was no longer Roman. It was global. Caesar understood what other generals did not. Victory on the battlefield was not enough. Rome had to be rebuilt, and so he set to work. He granted citizenship to thousands, bringing distant provinces into the Roman fold. He restructured debt, easing the burdens of the poor. He reformed the Senate, stuffing it with loyalists. And he reimagined time itself, creating the Julian calendar, the very structure we still use today. To some, he was a visionary, a man who saw beyond old traditions. But to others, he was something far more dangerous, a man unraveling the Republic in favor of one-man rule. The signs were everywhere, his image on coins like a king, a golden throne in the Senate like a king, his own month, Julius, in the calendar like a king. And then, the final insult. At the festival of the Lupercal, before a watching crowd, Mark Antony offered Caesar a crown. He refused, then refused again, and a third time. But he had considered it. And for many senators, that was enough. The whispers began, and soon, whispers turned into conspiracy. In the shadows, a faction gathered. They called themselves liberators, but history would call them murderers. Among them, Cassius, and Caesar's old friend, Brutus. Brutus, the man Caesar had trusted most, now believed that Caesar's death was Rome's only salvation. The plan was set. The date, March 15th, 44 BCE, the Ides of March. That morning, Caesar received a warning. A seer whispered, "Beware the Ides of March." Caesar chuckled, "The Ides have come." To which the seer replied, "Aye, but they have not yet gone." Inside the theater of Pompey, the Senate gathered. Caesar entered, unaware that 60 knives awaited him. Casca struck first, a dagger to the neck. Caesar stumbled, but before he could cry out, the rest closed in. Steel flashed, blood flew. He tried to fight back until he saw Brutus, and then he stopped. "Et tu, Brute?" "You too, Brutus," his voice broken, betrayed, and then he fell. At the base of Pompey's statue, a grim, twisted irony. The man who had killed the Republic now lay beneath the symbol of the world he destroyed. The conspirators had expected applause. They received silence. Rome did not celebrate. Rome wept. The Republic had lost its strongest man, but it had not been reborn. Mark Antony seized the moment. He entered the forum, holding aloft Caesar's blood-stained toga. He did not ask for justice. He demanded vengeance. And the people, they answered, Riots, flames, panic. The assassins fled, the Senate cowered, and Rome once again teetered on the edge of civil war. Julius Caesar was dead, but the Republic died with him. The liberators had killed a man, but not his legacy. The Republic they claimed to defend was already a memory. In the void, Rome turned to Caesar's avengers, Mark Antony, Lepidus, and Caesar's adopted son, Gaius Octavius. Together, they would form the Second Triumvirate, and together, they would hunt down the killers of Caesar and end the Republic once and for all. The proscriptions began. Death lists were nailed to the walls of the Forum, names etched in ink, fates sealed in blood. Enemies of the state, declared traitors, their property seized, their families ruined. Rome became a hunting ground. Among the condemned was Cicero. Once the Republic's greatest orator, a voice of reason, a defender of liberty. But he had spoken against Mark Antony, and now Antony had his revenge. Cicero was caught trying to flee. He did not plead, he did not beg. He simply offered his throat to the blade. His head was nailed to the rostra. His hands, those same hands that once wrote against tyranny, displayed beside it. The message was clear: the Republic was drowning in its own blood. 42 BCE, Philippi, Greece. The final act of the Republic began. Brutus and Cassius had raised their legions, an army of ideals. Their goal was not conquest, but redemption, to restore the Rome they believed in. But ideals alone could not stop the tide. The first clash was brutal. Brutus led his forces with brilliance, breaking through Octavian's line. The young heir barely escaped with his life. But Cassius was not so fortunate. A tragic miscommunication led him to believe Brutus had been defeated, and in despair, he chose death. He fell on his own sword, blinded by grief. And with him, hope dimmed. Now Brutus stood alone. For 2 weeks, he held firm. But when the final blow came, it came from Antony. Swift, merciless. Brutus's legions collapsed. The battlefield was strewn with the bodies of Rome's last defenders. Alone, Brutus fled into the hills. He sat beneath a withered tree, staring into nothing. Haunted by ghosts of duty, of friendship, of Caesar, he had lived by principle for virtue, but what had it brought? He had struck down his friend, believing it would save Rome. Instead, it had damned it. Es-tu brute? His sword lay before him. He whispered bitterly, "O wretched virtue! You were but a name, and yet I worshipped you as real." Brutus was gone, and with him the last flicker of the Republic. Brutus and Cassius were dead, their cause lost, their vision shattered. Rome still called itself a republic, but the truth was written in blood. The Senate had become a stage, the laws an illusion, the Republic a hollow shell. The Second Triumvirate would soon turn on itself. Old allies would become bitter enemies. But from the chaos, one man would rise, Octavian. The heir of Caesar, the master of survival, the future Augustus. The Republic was dead, but Rome was not yet at peace. Brutus and Cassius, Rome's last champions of senatorial power, fell at Philippi. Their dream died with them, and what replaced it? Not harmony, not order, but a quieter kind of tyranny, one with laurel wreaths and golden statues. Power had passed from the many to the one. At first, they held the illusion of unity. Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus, 3 men dividing a world. Antony ruled the war-hardened East, Octavian the politically vital West. Lepidus was left with Africa, a title more than a throne. But 3 rulers were always too many. Lepidus had once stood at Caesar's side, loyal, useful, forgotten. But when he reached for more, when he tried to claim Sicily, Octavian struck. His soldiers abandoned him. His dreams turned to ash. Octavian spared his life, but stripped him of all power. Exiled, reduced to nothing. The Second Triumvirate was no more. Now, only 2 remained. Antony and Octavian, bound by Caesar's shadow, driven by ambition, destined to destroy each other. Antony was a soldier, decisive, daring, forged in war. Octavian was something else entirely. A tactician, a master of optics, of alliances, of control. Their alliance had been born of need, but power truly could not be shared. For a time, they pretended. Antony married Octavia, Octavian's sister, a gesture of peace. But peace was a lie. Antony saw Octavian as a boy who wore Caesar's name like armor. Octavian saw Antony as reckless, foreign, corrupted by the East. Each man watched the other and waited. Antony turned to the East, to power, to Cleopatra. Octavian turned to Rome, to the Senate, to the people. Their letters grew cold, their agreements brittle. The mask of unity fell away. Rome had seen one civil war. Now, another was coming, and only one man would walk away as master. In the east, another force was pulling Antony away from Rome, one as seductive as it was dangerous: Cleopatra. To the Romans, she was a foreign queen. To Antony, she was everything Rome had denied him: power, loyalty, a kingdom that bent only to him. Their alliance was sealed in Tarsus. She came not as a monarch, but as a goddess. A golden barge on the Cydnus River, sails perfumed, draped in silks as Aphrodite herself. Incense filled the air, music echoed over the water, and Antony, lover of spectacle, was bewitched. But their union was not mere passion. It was strategy. It was empire. Antony needed Egypt's wealth. Cleopatra needed Rome's recognition. Together they imagined a new world, one that would rise from the east. In Rome, wars were not always fought with legions. Some battles were waged in the shadows, won not by swords but by whispers. And no one understood this better than Octavian. As Antony drifted further into Cleopatra's world, Octavian saw an opportunity. His enemy was no longer just a rival. He was a man who could be reshaped in the eyes of Rome. And so, with precision and patience, Octavian set in motion one of the most ruthless propaganda campaigns in history. It started with a whisper, a carefully placed rumor. Antony was no longer a Roman. They said he had abandoned his homeland, seduced by the luxuries of the East, bewitched by an Egyptian queen. They said he had forsaken the proud garments of a Roman general, choosing instead the silken robes of a foreign ruler. That he no longer marched with his legions, but instead reclined in Cleopatra's palace, feasting while Rome suffered. These were not accusations. These were weapons, designed to strike at Antony's very identity. And Rome was listening. Then came the final outrage, the donations of Alexandria. Before a lavish, adoring crowd, Antony made his declaration. He granted vast Roman lands to Cleopatra and their children. And at the heart of it all, a name that shook the very foundation of Rome itself: Caesarion, the son of Julius Caesar and Cleopatra, declared king of kings, the true heir of Rome. To the Senate, this was more than arrogance. This was treason. Octavian moved quickly. He stormed into the Senate, carrying what he claimed was Antony's will, stolen, he said, from the sacred archives of the Vestal Virgins. He read it aloud, every word a dagger. Antony wished to be buried, not in Rome, but in Alexandria, beside Cleopatra. A final, unforgivable betrayal. The Senate turned against him. The people whispered of treason. Octavian did not need to declare war on Antony. He declared war on Cleopatra. And long before the first sword was drawn, Antony had already lost. The Ionian Sea lay eerily still, as if the gods themselves were holding their breath. It was September 2nd, 31 BCE. Two great forces stood on the edge of history. This battle would decide the fate of Rome itself. Antony's fleet, bolstered by Egyptian reinforcements, held a formidable position at the mouth of the Ambracian Gulf. His ships, massive quinquiremes, were floating fortresses, built for power, not speed. Beside them, Cleopatra's fleet waited, carrying not just soldiers but a kingdom's fortune. For her, this was more than a battle. It was a gamble for an empire. But Octavian's admiral, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, had already laid the trap. For weeks he had strangled Antony's supply lines with an unrelenting naval blockade. His forces were well fed, well rested, ready. Antony's men were starving, desperate, trapped, with no path forward. Antony made a choice. He would break through Octavian's fleet, escape to Egypt, regroup, fight another day. The sun climbed higher, the sails unfurled, and then the signal was given. The sea exploded into war. Agrippa's ships moved like shadows, swift and deadly. Antony's great warships, too large, too slow, struggled to turn. Octavian's fleet struck first. Fire arrows lit up the sky, igniting sails, shattering hulls. The clash of steel, the thunder of ramming ships, the screams of drowning men. Smoke choked the sky. The water, once deep blue, turned black with ash and red with blood. Antony was no stranger to chaos. He had fought beside Caesar, triumphed in battles where others would have fled. Now he led from the front, shouting orders, rallying his men. They fought like lions, but valor was not enough. Then, at the height of battle, it happened. Cleopatra's fleet, without signal or warning, turned. Their sails caught the wind, and they fled, heading for Egypt. Antony froze. For the first time in his life, Mark Antony hesitated. His men watched in disbelief. Their commander, silent, staring at the retreating ships. And then, in one single fateful moment, he turned his ship and followed her, leaving his men behind, leaving his fate to the sea, leaderless, surrounded. Antony's fleet fell into ruin. Agrippa closed in like a vice. The great warships burned. Some were sunk, others were boarded, slaughtered to the last man. By nightfall, the waters of Actium were littered with the wreckage of Antony's last hope. The sea, once calm and blue, now ran red. Antony reached Cleopatra's ship, but there were no cheers, no embrace, only silence. Because in that moment, he knew he had not just lost a battle, he had lost Rome. Behind them, Octavian watched as the sea grew quiet. He had won, but he was not finished. The war was not over. He would chase Antony and Cleopatra to the ends of the earth, if he had to, and soon he would. The sea no longer roared. The fires of Actium had burned out, leaving only the whispers of the dead and the distant sound of Octavian's war drums. Antony and Cleopatra had escaped, but they had not won. They fled to Egypt, but there was nowhere left to run. In Alexandria, Cleopatra retreated to her palace. Her mind raced. She had always been a survivor. She had outmaneuvered kings, seduced the most powerful men in Rome, ruled Egypt with an iron will wrapped in silk. But this was different. This was the endgame. Mark Antony, once Rome's greatest general, was now a broken man. His fleet was gone, his legions surrendered, his allies vanished. His name, once spoken with reverence, was now a curse in the streets of Rome. And yet, in these final days, Cleopatra did not abandon him. She could have fled. She could have betrayed him, offered Octavian her throne in exchange for mercy, but she stayed, whether out of love or defiance. She stood beside the man the world had turned against. Octavian wasted no time. He pursued them relentlessly. Because as long as Antony and Cleopatra lived, Rome was not yet his. Egypt was the last obstacle to his absolute power, and he would not leave it standing. By the summer of 30 BCE, Octavian's legions stood at the gates of Alexandria. The city, the crown jewel of the Mediterranean, now faced the full wrath of Rome. Desperate, Antony gathered what little remained of his forces. He rode out one last time. But his men knew the truth. There was no victory left to win. And so, before the battle even began, they abandoned him. The gods themselves seemed to mock him. He returned to the palace, not defeated by swords, but by fate. Then came the moment that shattered his soul. A messenger arrived, breathless, pale as death. He fell to his knees and spoke the words Antony could not bear to hear. The queen is dead. His breath caught in his throat. Cleopatra, gone? No, it couldn't be. She was his reason to fight, his reason to live. And without her, what was left? He unsheathed his sword. His men begged him to stop, but he had already made his choice. Rome had won, but it would never take him alive. With one last whisper to the gods, he turned the blade upon himself. And then, a second messenger arrived. Cleopatra was alive. The truth crashed over him like a wave. She had spread false news of her death to test her allies. And now, Antony lay dying for a lie. They brought him to Cleopatra's mausoleum, where she had locked herself away, fearing Octavian's wrath. She screamed when she saw him. Blood stained his tunic, his breath, ragged. She reached for him, held him, and in his final moments he whispered, "I die, Egypt." The woman who had conquered kings, who had bent Rome to her will, wept. She kissed his lips and felt his life slip away in her arms. Do not trust him. And then, nothing. Octavian arrived soon after. He demanded her surrender, but Cleopatra, ever the queen, refused to be paraded through Rome, a chained spectacle for his triumph. She had defied the greatest empire in history, and she would not let it claim her soul. 3 days later, she adorned herself in royal robes. She lay upon a golden couch, and she placed an asp to her breast. With one last breath, she allowed its venom to take her. When Octavian entered her chamber, he found her cold, still, yet regal, a queen, even in death. With their deaths, Egypt fell. The last great kingdom of the ancient world was swallowed by Rome, and Octavian, now Augustus, became the undisputed master of an empire, and yet, even in victory, he knew Antony and Cleopatra had become legends. Their names would echo through time, in the halls of power, in the songs of poets, in the hearts of lovers who dared to defy the world, because some stories are too great to die.